Do you remember this movie? Well, this month, May 2024, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 celebrated its 10th anniversary. Not only has it been 10 years since 2014's snapback, skinny jeans, and pop punk revival, but it's been a decade since Andrew Garfield donned his red and blue suit for the Amazing Spider-Man franchise. If you didn't know, but still somehow clicked on this video, the Amazing Spider-Man series was a reboot of Sony Pictures' 2002 Spider-Man trilogy, directed by Sam Raimi and featuring this guy, Tobey Maguire, the Spidey from literally all the memes.
Pizza time.
Yep, only a few years after wrapping their first foray into the Spideyverse, Sony ordered another round of Spider-Man for the table with 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man. Now, you may be asking yourself, why would Sony do that? Reboot their uber-successful franchise that, during its lifetime in the 2000s, earned over $2 billion in just box office revenue? Well, the answer is kind of easy. The MCU. Now, I know a lot of people are tired of the MCU, DCEU, and superhero franchises in general. Personally, I'm not, but hey, you're valid. While it seems like every movie series is trying to turn itself into an interconnected cinematic universe now, back in 2008, this was not the case. When Marvel Studios released Iron Man in 2008, they didn't really have a plan to create a MCU, or an interconnected cinematic universe. But by 2012, they released the first Avengers film, and they were off to the cinematic universe races. Now, what does this have to do with Sony and Spider-Man, you might ask? Well, Spider-Man is the most recognizable hero in all of Marvel Comics. Not only because he's the one that fits best into all sorts of media, from ice cream to kids shows to PS4 games, but because Peter Parker is an iconic underdog character that people have a really easy time relating to. Everybody's been a dweeby teen who wishes they had the power to make real change in their lives, even if that change is just standing up to a bully or winning money in an underground wrestling cage match. That was wild, Toby. The point is, Spider-Man's appeal is the innocent and naive power fantasy that most people have as kids. Add his super iconic design to that, and boom, he's instantly recognizable. So, of course, in building out their MCU, Marvel Studios wanted Spider-Man. But Sony had the rights to him. Remember that figure I quoted earlier about how Sony made a little more than $2 billion off of Tobey's Spider-Man trilogy from worldwide box office? Well, that number is only counting the box office revenue, and not all the money Sony made off of licensing and merchandising anything and everything that had to do with that trilogy. Spider-Man was a moneymaker for Sony, a huge one, and they weren't going to give him up to Marvel if they could help it. Marvel knew this, understood it, and therefore did the next best thing they could think of. Force Sony to make another Spider-Man movie post Spider-Man 3. You know, the one with the dancing and the black suit. The deal was deceptively simple. If Sony didn't make another Spider-Man movie in the next 5 years, the rights would revert to Marvel. Easy as pie to complete, right? Except not easy as pie, because Sony's plan for a Spider-Man 4 with Sam Raimi directing fell through and left them stuck up a creek without a paddle. Until someone, who knows who, probably a scheming young executive or a sleepy intern, was like, hey, we could always just reboot the franchise. And I assume everyone at Sony Pictures turned to look at them like, are you crazy? It's been less than 5 years since we wrapped Spider-Man 3. Won't the audience be totally peeved? And they were like, not if we make him hot this time.
All right, let's do this one last time.
The Amazing Spider-Man 2012 opened to a $758 million box office and was both a critical and fiscal success. Not only was Andrew Garfield's iteration of the web-slinging Wonder Kid different enough from Tobey's to be both endearing and have people fighting bloody fan wars in the streets, but his more flippant humor
You know, in the future, if you're gonna steal cars, don't dress like a car thief, man.
and endearing scene chemistry with Gwen Stacy
Character. It's my uncle. He's a pathological liar, and he thought you were someone else.
Man, you don't have me on your computer.
Yeah, I mean,
basically slam dunked Sony's hopes and dreams for starting a new franchise. That was until The Amazing Spider-Man 2. With a smaller box office opening than any of Sony's other Spider projects, and their first critical review bombing, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was in many ways the Trojan horse of Sony's new Spider-Man-centered cinematic universe. Oh yeah, did I mention Sony didn't just want to keep Spider-Man from the MCU. They wanted to build out their own Spider-Verse. No, not that one. And they wanted to do it by creating spin-offs using iconic Spidey villains with slated movies like The Sinister Six, Black Cat, Venom, and Morbius. From 10 years in the future, we know only 2 of those movies actually came to fruition. One for better or worse. But the point stands that Sony had a whole lot riding on the success of Amazing Spider-Man 2. So, what happened? How did one of the most anticipated superhero movies of the 2010s totally beef it? Well, this is that story. The story of self-sabotage, back alley MCU meddling, and the straw that eventually broke the spider's back, poor narrative structure. Picture this, if you will. You just come off of writing The Amazing Spider-Man. We've wrapped filming. It was a resounding success. And you completed the Herculean task, the thing they said could not be done. You established a new Spider-Man character that was different enough from Tobey's previous performance to actually bag you respect from fans. I mean, everybody had to be, giving each other pats on the back. They already got greenlit for their sequel, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, so they were excited to bring in more obscure Spider-Man villains. I say obscure with these big parentheses because they're basically the main Spider-Man villains from the comics, but for moviegoers, they're different, they're new. The hiring of 3 all-new writers was a surprise to fans, because originally we were led to believe that James Vanderbilt, who is credited as having done the brunt of the story work on the original Amazing Spider-Man, was going to be returning to pen the sequel. This did not happen. While it appeared as though Vanderbilt was working on a sequel, as he admitted to doing in an interview with the Hollywood Reporter in 2011, saying that he'd sort of gotten the green light from Sony executives after pitching them his view for movies 2 and 3, he isn't credited as having written a single word of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Ooh, yeah, not a great look. It's like he just disappeared overnight. Fans and journalists alike speculate that the movie we got was likely heavily based on Vanderbilt's early drafts for the film, mostly because the movie introduces a lot of interesting and iconic characters and plot threads, but isn't really able to carry through on what it promises. Now, I want to be clear. This is not hate to the new writers that were brought on. Okay, nobody ever wants to write a bad movie. Nobody ever sets out to write a bad movie, all right? Sometimes things just happen, whether it be studio pressure, deadlines, or conflicting heads in a writer's room. Sometimes you just end up with a script that's not as stellar and thought out as it could have been. Unfortunately for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, it's pretty easy to guess what changed over at Sony between the pitches and the actual writing of ASM2. The Avengers. When 2012's Avengers hit the screen, it was not only an incredible box office success, but it was also the birth of cinematic superhero universes as we know them. We talked about this earlier, but Sony was heavily inspired by work going on at Marvel Studios at the time of The Amazing Spider-Man's release and production. So it's not too crazy to believe that the MCU was the reason behind their order for a new Spideyverse. Sony fell into the same trap that a lot of studios did after the success of Avengers, jumping straight to the team-up movie without actually doing any of the legwork. A franchise like Amazing Spider-Man, which was doing incredible amounts of work to separate itself from its predecessor, this meant that they ended up having to bank on the audience's affection and knowledge for a previous iteration of the character, as opposed to being able to naturally build the character up throughout the film and in the franchise. This is a message to the Green Goblin. Rip to that dude, he had potential, just didn't pan out. So basically, an impatient Sony who wanted to run before they could walk would end up fatally wounding their burgeoning franchise. But honestly, if the only problem with the movie had been the too many villains plot, we probably still would have gotten a third one. So that means that Sony wasn't the only one to blame for putting Amazing Spider-Man in the ground. And the next culprit will actually not surprise you. I said it before, and I'll say it again, Spider-Man is the most popular character in all of Marvel Comics. Marvel really, really wanted him for the MCU. In an interview with director Joss Whedon, he admitted that he'd wanted to work Spider-Man into Avengers Age of Ultron all the way back in 2015, but couldn't because the infamous Sony-Marvel shared custody Spider deal hadn't dried its ink till after the movie finished shooting. Another instance of Marvel pining after Spidey, allegedly their inclusion of Oscorp Tower in the New York skyline for Avengers 2012. While the building didn't end up making it into the movie, apparently because of some render issues, sure Marvel, sure, they supposedly wanted to fill out the New York skyline and complement the Avengers Tower with the Oscorp building, to hint not only at heroes to come, but to imply that the Amazing Spider-Man was probably taking place in the same universe as the Avengers. Of course, these cameos never happen, and we know that the first appearance of Spider-Man wouldn't come till after the Amazing Spider-Man was dead. Tom Holland first appeared in that iconic red and blue suit in Captain America Civil War as the decade's new darling Spider-Man, and it was all thanks to Sony's new 5-movie deal to loan Spider-Man to Marvel. So Spider-Man was allowed to debut in the MCU with flying colors alongside a star-studded cast including Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man and Chris Evans' Captain America. What was this infamous deal between Sony and Marvel for Spider-Man? How did he get into Captain America Civil War? Well, Sony still wasn't willing to give up Spider-Man. Not to the MCU, not to anybody. Over their dead body. Or in this case, over Amazing Spider-Man 2's dead body. When the Amazing Spider-Man 2 performed well under Sony's expectations, only in the $700 million ballpark range, Sony was ready to come back to the table with Marvel to negotiate getting Spider-Man into the MCU. Basically, you can kind of think of it as, if you can't beat him, join him. So Sony did. Of course, they weren't about to actually give Spidey to Marvel. Are you literally insane? They would never. But they were willing to loan Spider-Man, whatever their new iteration would be, to Marvel for 5 movie appearances. Some of these appearances, you will know, include Civil War, Avengers Endgame, and Spider-Man Homecoming, to name a few. Currently on timeline, we only have one more Spider-Man appearance under contract between Sony and Marvel before they come back to the table to either renegotiate or drift apart again. But the reason that we got any of Tom Holland's Spider-Man in the MCU was because The Amazing Spider-Man 2 essentially failed. To me, the most interesting part of the entire deal, though, was the nuance Marvel put in to having Spidey in the MCU. Essentially, while Sony would be able to keep the rights and a bulk of the revenue from any Spider-Man appearance or any Spider-Man solo film they would produce, like the Homecoming series, Marvel would get complete creative control over Spider-Man's story. So while Spider-Man got to cameo in their universe, they would also get to put cameos into Spider-Man's universe over at Sony. Which, honestly, I imagine at that point for Sony was kind of a godsend. They had supposedly sent Spider-Man 2, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, over to Kevin Feige for notes, and then reportedly didn't take any of them when he gave feedback. So, yeah, free story direction, and we get to bank off of big names in the MCU. It was a win-win. While I don't think Marvel was creating any ASM2 specific voodoo dolls or, dunking spoons in pickle juice to wish ASM bad luck, it was also in their best interest to get Spidey away from Sony and to, the long and the short, have Amazing Spider-Man fail. To be fair, I don't think Sony was that torn up about it either. Despite having to cancel contracts for Amazing Spider-Man 3 and a potential 4, which had apparently already been signed according to Andrew Garfield and the director during interviews, they were just as happy to make money somewhere else, even if it was outside of the Sony creative team. Especially because Spider-Man Homecoming made $880 million in worldwide box office. Yeah, it became the highest grossing Spider-Man movie at the time and actually ended up bringing home, I think, $1 billion. The first Spider-Man movie to do that. So they definitely weren't crying tears over The Amazing Spider-Man after that deal had been signed. Trust me. I'm about to say something crazy. I'm gonna back up for this. I'm about to say something crazy. Maybe even controversial. But MCU meddling and Sony sabotage aside, having the MCU on your back and Sony calling down for more villain stat didn't automatically have to equal a bad movie. Even without the original creator of The Amazing Spider-Man behind them, the new team of writers could have prevailed. We could live in a world where Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man was the one who fought Cap on the tarmac, where he was the guy that caught the shield. But we don't. Because ultimately, everyone's complaint about Amazing Spider-Man 2, critics, fans, random moviegoers, was that at its core, it was a bad movie. But what does that mean, right? How do we quantify and discuss the merits of what makes a movie good and bad without just saying, it sucked? Alrighty, we have gotten to the portion of the video paid for by my parents. Yeah, because they sent me to film school. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Alright, okay, so there are a couple ways that we learned how to analyze films in school. And a lot of them have to do with plotting out act structure and then analyzing whether or not that structure is objectively good or bad. I.e., does it follow the right page count? Does it hit act breaks at the right time? And does it then generally tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end? But that's honestly kind of a boring way to talk about films, and it skips over the very real criticism a lot of people have about act structure analysis, which is that a good movie could have technically bad act structure, and a bad movie could have technically good act structure. So in that case, I instead want to turn to narrative analysis. I'll be focusing more on examining what story the writers in Amazing Spider-Man 2 were trying to tell, as opposed to really debating if, ending Act 1 on page 36 worked. Because it kind of doesn't matter, and I don't think you care. But if you do care about act structure, and you'd like to learn more about it and sort of how it works, I would suggest checking out Lesson from the Screenplays videos about breaking down 3 and 5 act structure. I will link them below, but they are super interesting and a great learning tool if you're into that sort of thing. Here's the big question. What's this movie about?
The story is essentially about Peter being haunted by his past, by his father's disappearance, Captain Stacy's death and his warning, and Peter's inability to let go of the past is holding Peter back from getting what he wants in the present. This is the emotional arc Peter has in this film, first with Gwen and then with his aunt. During his hero's journey through the film, the lesson Peter learns is that he needs to move on from the past and his mistakes so that he can make his own choices unburdened for the future. Those choices ultimately lead him to continue on as Spider-Man and as a symbol of hope for New York. I bring up the hero's journey because at its core, that's what superhero movies are all about. The mythos of the hero and the trials the hero must endure to learn the lesson his adventure is trying to teach him. So the core themes of a superhero story have to reflect on the lessons our hero has yet to learn. In this case, for Amazing Spider-Man 2, the main lessons that they're trying to teach Peter are to let go and make new choices. These lessons and themes would be all well and good if Peter ever seemed to have a problem making choices and letting go of his past. But he doesn't. His whole arc in the first movie was about becoming Spider-Man and learning that he has to make the choice to help people if he can, that it's his responsibility, and it's Uncle Ben who tells him that. That's when Peter learned his lesson about the power of his own choices. And during the course of the first movie, Peter is able to learn and grow from the mistakes that he made that caused Uncle Ben's death, not so much dwelling on the past as learning and growing from it. As for his parents, Peter doesn't seem all that hung up on them. He only ever mentions them when he doesn't want to take a lecture from Uncle Ben, and otherwise doesn't seem that bothered by their disappearance. He seems to have processed it normally and let it go. So that's weird, right? That's a little weird. Your whole movie is centered around the idea that Peter can't let go of his past and needs to learn to make his own choices. But it doesn't seem like he needs to do those things. And ultimately, that's the kicker of writing a sequel movie, right? You have a whole 2 hours of lore and characterization from a previous flick at your back that you still have to play with and incorporate. And I think the real issue with The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is that the writers have a really selective memory of the first movie. After obsessively, studying this flick for like a month, I think I know the real problems with it, I found its kryptonite, I found the thorn in its side, I found the catalysts, the keys for why it landed squarely in bad sequel territory. Here they are. Number 1, there are no actionable goals for Peter or Spider-Man in the movie. Number 2, there are no stakes for Peter or the audience in it either. And number 3, there are too many dead dads. That's right, The problem with this movie is not that it has too many villains, and it is not that it was Sinister 6 sequel bait, Those didn't matter. You know what mattered? You know what really punched this movie in the face? These guys. Throughout the film, a ton of the plot and character motivations are affected by men who die off screen, like Richard Parker, Peter's dad, Norman Osborn, Harry's dad, and Captain Stacy, Gwen's dad. Peter is frequently haunted by Captain Stacy. Whenever he hangs out with Gwen, he feels as if he's breaking his promise to him, right? And Peter is so affected by this perceived promise breaking that he literally breaks up with Gwen over it. Peter's also all wigged out about his perceived abandonment by his own father, which he didn't seem to have a problem with his mom leaving him because he never brings that up, but I mean, I guess, who cares, right? but he becomes obsessed with his father's disappearance and figuring out, like, why he left in a way that he just wasn't concerned with in the first movie. Then you have Harry, right, Peter's daddy narrative foil in the story, who is also haunted by his dad, both literally because his father passed on to him this fatal genetic disease, and figuratively in that he also has gnarly abandonment issues. Funnily enough, you know which deceased father figure isn't part of the plot? Uncle Ben. Yeah, one thing that really stood out to me on my first watch of Amazing Spider-Man 2 is that Uncle Ben never gets a cameo in this movie. Aside from when Peter gets dropped off in that first flashback, we never see him. He's never there. If any father figure is haunting the Spider-Man narrative, it's Uncle Ben. And for some reason, the only character that ever brings him up is Aunt May. I don't know why the writers made this choice. I really don't. Because Uncle Ben is a character that Peter and May have a lot of emotional attachment to. And he's actually one of the only characters we got to see in the first movie outside of flashbacks and cameo lines. And whose death we, as the audience, actually got to witness and resonate with. So it's just jarring that he's suddenly become unimportant in our sequel. And that there is the real problem that I have with the Dead Dad's plot, where the audience cares about Uncle Ben to some extent because we got attached to him from the first movie, or we're just attached to him because Peter cares about him. We just have no attachment to any of these other characters. Not Norman Osborn, not Richard Parker, and not Captain Stacy. And it's not the audience's fault that they don't care about them, because Peter, Harry, and Gwen's dads aren't main characters in this movie. The audience had an interest in Norman upon his introduction, because we know he's the Green Goblin, but he immediately dies. So we lose interest in him because we know nothing's gonna happen there. And then we have Peter's dad, who we care about just as much as any parent who dies in a superhero origin story, which is to say, not really at all. And then Captain Stacy, who was probably the most annoying part of the Amazing Spider-Man's first film because he was a secondary antagonist that nobody wanted to see again after he died. And yet, these dudes cannot get out of this movie. It's like they have not only hijacked the plot, but suddenly they've struck Peter with these ghastly visions and an obsession with his father. Like, it seemed like an arc that he'd already completed in the first film when, Uncle Ben dies and he basically calls him his father, and, they get the whole "with great power comes great responsibility" line. It would have been one thing, right, to have Peter haunted by Uncle Ben and his death. That's his main motivation in being Spider-Man and in continuing to be Spider-Man. That he helps because he has the power to, and because other people will get hurt if he doesn't. Peter already learned that lesson about how important the choices he makes are, right? We talked about this earlier. But that means that Peter doesn't learn a lesson at all in the second movie. We're going backwards, but let's bring it up again, okay? Because it's important. The mythos of the hero revolves around their journey. And those journeys are, like I said, usually accompanied by lessons. Just because a movie is a sequel doesn't mean we can do away with the hero's journey or subsequent lesson. Peter needs to learn something new about himself over the course of these 2 hours. Note, I said something new about himself, not his dad. If one of the main questions your movie poses and Peter laments over the entire film is, why did his father leave him? Unfortunately, everyone in the audience already has the answer, right? It's because his dad created a super secret spider venom that gave people superpowers and everybody wanted it, and so they killed him for it. Boom. Even if that's not the answer to a T that the writers later give us in the second movie, the audience feels that the question has been answered, right? Before the movie has even begun. Nobody was asking this question. Not even Peter. So making your whole movie revolve around answering this question feels redundant. I wholeheartedly, honestly believe that if the writers had been like just a lot less preoccupied, with middle-aged men who were dead, buried, and off screen, and more time creating new drama, mystery, and bad guy fights for Spider-Man, we probably would have had a more successful sequel film. And I cannot stress this enough, but literally, why is The Amazing Spider-Man full of dead dads? Alright, we gotta move on from dead dads, okay? I could talk about those ghosts till I'm blue in the face, but it's not gonna help us, so we're moving on. Alright, let's talk actionable goals. Or, in the case of this film, lack thereof. How many times do you think Spider-Man fights in this movie? Just like off the top of your head. Would your guess be 3? Because the answer is 3. Spider-Man has exactly 3 fights in this film. 1 in each act. Act 1 opens with a big fight. Act 2, he fights Electro at the top of the act before the midpoint. And Act 3, we have our big climax and our final showdown. And I guess technically you could count that little tidbit at the end with Rhino as fight 4, but we don't actually see him fight, he just swings a grate at him and then the movie ends. So I'm not gonna count it. Think about that for a second though. In a 2-hour movie, we only get 3 fights with Spider-Man. That's insane, dude. Like, in the first Amazing Spider-Man, we consistently see Peter go off and advance the plot as Spider-Man, in the suit. Either by hunting down bad guys with star tattoos on their wrist, or by crawling through the sewers looking for lizard men. And then when the drama of, being Spider-Man starts to leak into his mundane life as Peter Parker, he freaks out and the stakes increase. But in this movie, where we only see Spider-Man fight 3 times, we never see him take action towards his goal in the suit. And that's because the writers did not give him an actionable goal. What do I mean by that, you might ask? I mean that Spider-Man can't go out and punch his dead dad in the face for answers to his own disappearance. That's a job for the Ghostbusters, Spider-Man. No, but really, his goal in the film is, to solve his dad's disappearance. But that's not a goal he can achieve by fighting, which inherently makes it a bad plot for Spider-Man. I'm not saying it's a bad plot in general. You could make a good movie, and people have made good movies about solving their parents' mysterious disappearances or deaths. But that's not a Spider-Man movie, right? Spidey needs villains to fight, bad guys to web, people to punch. But our main bad guy, Electro, gets webbed up and tossed away at the top of Act 2. And we don't get another villain to fight, the Green Goblin. We don't get him. We don't get him till the 3rd act of the movie. So what do we end up doing? We end up spending an hour watching Peter do limbo with his dead dad. I said I would stop talking about them. I mean it this time. I might be being a little harsh, a little worked up about this, okay? But it's from a loving place, alright? I mean it. I don't mean any hate. It's just that if Spider-Man's only actionable goal, right, is to save the city, which is sort of his default goal all the time, anytime we see Spider-Man, then we have to do something else, right? We need a problem that only Spider-Man can solve, either by fighting his way out of them or sleuthing his way out of them. They are mysteries that Peter Parker couldn't figure out if he didn't have the mask. But throughout the film, none of what Peter does necessitates him being Spider-Man. And in fact, It just ends up causing more problems that he is Spider-Man, which means the plot has him spend more time out of the suit than in it, which is insane also, because in a Spider-Man movie, I'm here to see Spider-Man. If I wanted to read about the great, mundane life of Peter Parker, I would read fan fiction, and that's free. Oh, oy vey. Okay, I can't talk about it more. I'm gonna give myself a headache. But yeah, he doesn't have an actionable goal, and the movie really suffers because of it. Speaking of actionable goals, though, let's talk about the stakes in this film, because they are very closely linked, and those didn't do great either. One of our goals in storytelling is to be consistently raising the stakes. Stakes are basically what a character stands to lose if the thing they're doing doesn't go right. So an example of this would be, let's say in Act 1 you need money to buy a house, right? And then, going into Act 2, we could raise the stakes by saying, oh no, you got in a car accident. Now you don't just need that money to buy a house in the future, but you need that money to pay your medical bills now, right? Raising the stakes. If we think back to our act structure, the goal of every act is to raise the stakes and pose new questions to the audience. Unfortunately, Amazing Spider-Man 2 is kind of stakeless, meaning that because Peter's goal isn't actionable to Spider-Man, his stakes don't increase as he tries to solve the mystery. Wow, it's almost like everything's cyclical, right? But part of that is because there can be no stake in solving the murder of someone who's already dead, right? The stake can't be, in Act 1, oh, I want to find out, who killed my dad. In Act 2, what's the stake raise? It doesn't, because your dad's already dead. Nothing can happen to him. And conversely, you're Spider-Man, so nothing that killed him could kill you. In Act 1, when we were assembling the cast and turning Max Dillon into Electro, we established a stake. Peter could lose Gwen, right? But that stake is immediately cut when Peter breaks up with her. By separating her from the Spidey drama, he basically takes away a whole set of stakes for himself and the story. Peter has effectively already lost Gwen at the end of Act 1, so he can't continue to lose her. You'll see what I'm saying in a second. So when we're heading into Act 2, the drama with Electro, his fight right at the beginning, and then Gwen's bombshell that she's moving to England should be raising the stakes. But they don't feel like that. Because, again, Peter has already effectively lost Gwen, and she tells us that she wants to go to England. So we're not really losing her so much as she's leaving for good. And it doesn't seem like there's anything that Peter can do to stop that, or to make her stay. That's, again, another unactionable goal for Peter. He can't change her mind, and that means that we nullify that stake. So there's no stake in the first part or the first half of Act 2. At the top of Act 3, when Peter tells Gwen he's going to move with her to England, we don't believe that either. And that's because, right, as an audience, we have the meta understanding that Spider-Man is a New York-based hero, and that he's not going to permanently leave New York for any considerable stretch of time. But that means that his decision there doesn't convince us. The same way that the stakes didn't convince us previously that anything was in jeopardy. And because we never felt like Gwen was really in jeopardy, when she dies at the end of Act 3, the ultimate loss feels more like a crappy consequence. It doesn't have the full impact of the worst thing that could happen to Peter. And, part of that is because if we never believed that Gwen would stay, when she dies and effectively leaves forever, it already felt like she was gone. The only other stake we get is in Act 2, and it's, will Harry die? Or, more specifically, will Peter let Harry die? Now, this is technically a problem that is solvable by Spider-Man. Unfortunately, Peter's immediate refusal to help him cuts the steak right in half. We're not worried about Harry, and we immediately realize, oh, he's gonna go just full Green Goblin. Which, at the end of the day, neither us nor Peter have stake in that happening, right? Because we only just met Harry, and we haven't had the time to form a connection with him as an audience, which is unfortunate because Harry is such a big part of Peter's story in the comics, and especially in the previous Sony Spidey series. If we were supposed to become attached to Harry just from hearing his name and seeing him and Peter exchange sort of awkward jokes with each other, it didn't work. And what's worse is that during his introduction, we are asked as the audience to take the biggest burden on that we can for a character. We need to root for him not to die. And at first you might be like, whoa, dude, that's so harsh. When I watched this movie, I didn't want Peter to die. I never want a character to die. But, alright, keep your pants on. Let's be real. One of the hardest things to do as a writer and a storyteller is to get people to care about your main characters. It just is. People don't inherently care, and that's fine. You have to work for it, right? Part of the heavy lifting goes to the actors and the casting directors and the on-set director, right? Who are working to bring this character to life. But as the writer, you have the singular opportunity and really responsibility, I would say, to give the character a fighting chance, right? To endear themselves to the audience. That means that you have the opportunity to give new characters scenes, stakes, and arcs which will make the audience like them one way or another. So there's no stake in Harry becoming the Green Goblin or dying. At least not a stake the audience really cares about. And again, it's not their fault that they don't. Which means Peter's second possible set of stakes just gets wiped off the table, leaving the truth behind, which is that Max is the most well-written character in this movie, which is super unfortunate because he gets immediately shelved for the bulk of the picture and only brought back in, the end of Act 2, beginning of Act 3 for the final showdown fight. His goals were actionable. He was a sympathetic character to the audience that we were easily understanding, and we generally got why he was becoming a villain and why he hated Spider-Man. But in the end, the obsession with dead dads, unactionable goals, and instant microwave villains not only pulled down Max, but it pulled down the entire story. Now, I have been talking for quite some time today about The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but you might still have some questions on your mind. I know that there's probably a big one you're asking right now, which is, hey, what about that too many villains problem? Because you talked about it a lot. And I did. I mentioned it a lot in the first half of this video, that one of the whole problems with the franchise was that they put in too many villains in their second movie. But I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to let you behind the curtain. I don't actually think that's the truth. There are successful movies with multiple villains. Think Spider-Verse, where we have established bad guys, right, cropping up left and right, while we still maintain our main bad guy in Kingpin. Or think about The Dark Knight, where we watch the origin of Harvey Dent's becoming Two-Face, and also deal with the Joker in our main plot. That story juggles both villains surprisingly well, even having time to give Harvey Dent his villain rises moment at the very end of the third act. With both those examples, though, the key to having multiple villains is the pre-established or previously established villain within the narrative. In Spider-Verse, we've heard of all these bad guys before, or if not, we see them on screen and they are introduced to us as bad guys who already want to kill Spider-Man. In Dark Knight, Joker is coming up with a new scheme, but he's already the Joker. He's not Jack Napier slowly descending into madness. He's already 100% white face paint, scars on his face. He's an established villain, and his villainy not only increases the stakes in the film, but actively contributes to the downfall of Harvey Dent and the rise of Two-Face. That's why that movie really feels clean. You have two bad guys, but they're so interwoven that they're not competing with each other for screen time. Amazing Spider-Man 2 tried to establish two villains in one movie, which is just a crazy, impossible task. Quite honestly, I don't think they needed to do it. And this isn't even me saying, cut one of the villains. I'm just saying, if they'd kept one of those villains as a pre-established bad guy who we didn't have to watch the origin story for, then I think we would have had enough time to give spotlight to both Goblin and Electro. But because we have two origin stories, they are by nature going to be fighting for screen time. That being said though, the biggest time sap of the whole movie is still the dead dads. I will die on that hill, okay? That is the plot that ultimately needed to be swapped out. Erase all the headlines, because this is what they should have printed. Again though, I want to reiterate, while I've been very excited and loud in this video, this is in no way hate or belittlement or shame on the authors, okay? Writing a script is hard. Alright, writing good stories under pressure on a deadline is even harder, right? All these screenwriters worked on a ton of other cool projects that might be your favorite movies. They worked on the J.J. Abrams Star Trek trilogy, they worked on the reboot Jumanji stuff, and they worked on the original Transformers series. All cool titles to their names. They just had a bad turn, this movie. And I can tell you, as somebody who went to film school for screenwriting, you're not rewarded in any way for writing great action or writing a superhero story or anything like that. I think I only my entire college career had one professor, tell me my action was the best part of my work, which thank you, love you, Jeffrey. But in a writer's room, I think honestly the script for Amazing Spider-Man 2 as a superhero story would have done a lot better than just a straight hero movie like, say, Spider-Man Homecoming. But I think this story could have been saved. It had great potential and good bones, even if it felt like there were some outside forces working against it. If you're interested in hearing my silly little pitch for how I would have fixed or what I would have done differently in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, then leave a like on this video or comment down below about how you would have fixed it, because I don't know. Maybe I'll make that video in the future. Either way, I have spent a lot of time thinking about The Amazing Spider-Man 2 this month alone. And while we never got that third movie, I am happy to say that we did get some closure for Andrew Garfield's sticky boy in the form of Spider-Man No Way Home, which I believe is actually coming back into theaters again for the summer of 24. So this is not sponsored, but I'm fairly sure you could probably go catch No Way Home in theaters next month. So not sponsored, but do that if you're into it, you know what I'm saying? In the end, the Amazing Spider-Man franchise was just a little ahead of its time. It was honestly just unlucky that Amazing Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield weren't the ones picked up for the MCU tie-in. And while I did my best to bring you the Amazing Spider-Man 2's story, I wasn't actually in any of those rooms or executive meetings with Sony and Marvel. And it's not just because I was 13 at the time they were happening, okay? I had opinions. I would have brought them to the table. But that's all to say that this is kind of a disclaimer to take everything that I've said with a little bit of a grain of salt for legal reasons. Do not come for me. Do not. Last thing, absolutely last thing that I will say on this is that I think at least time has been very kind to the Spider-Man franchise and IP in general. If you like a movie or a series, it's really important to celebrate it and talk about it and keep it, in the conversation. That's how we get sequels, and that's how we get, revivals. That's how we get No Way Home type of movies, right? In this case, I'm not sure you'll get a third Amazing Spider-Man ever. That one you might just have to take to the streets to write as your own fan fiction, but you know what? I support you. I'm sending you positive energy. I will read it. No, I won't read it. I'm Amazing Spider-Man now, okay? So, happy anniversary, Amazing Spider-Man 2. You are 10 years old. Maybe we'll see you in the Wolverine Deadpool movie. Maybe we won't. Cue the outro music!